Here is the scariest part of the modern mindset when it comes to film criticism. We live in an age where we're comfortable letting a number, not an argument, a number, decide which movies are allowed a fair chance. And we hold this number in such high regard that it is the first thing we refer to when deciding what we watch. This number is released before the movie, meaning that people are already encouraged to decide whether or not they are going to like it before watching it. Worse still, this number is neither an argument nor is it a grade, it's just an aggregate. It effectively means that if half the critics watching the movie think it's a masterpiece and the other half think it's mediocre, the movie is going to get a score hovering around 50%. If all the critics watching a movie think it's okay, decent, worth watching but nothing special, it's still going to get anywhere from 60 to 90. I'm not trying to say Man of Steel and Batman v Superman are perfect movies, and I'm not saying Suicide Squad deserves another Oscar either.
For Suicide Squad,
but I do think these films keep getting screwed over because their heroes are, quite frankly, too popular for their own good. These two have starred in their own animated series, their own games, and their own live-action movies. Meanwhile, Diana here is rather new to the starring role. If there's an advantage in this scenario, is that nobody knows what to expect from a Wonder Woman film. If you ask a regular moviegoer where Superman came from, most of them will probably be able to name drop Krypton. If you ask about his power set, they will tell you he can fly and shoot lasers from his eyes, among other things. If you ask about his enemies, people will mention Lex Luthor, Zod, maybe Brainiac. You only really start running into problems if you ask about his fighting style, his goals, and his willingness to take a life for the good of the many. This is because previous adaptations of the character have hardly explored these aspects. A good chunk of the general audience that goes to watch a Superman film is not looking for the discovery of new elements. Instead, with the association of the name Superman, they are looking for the familiar elements that they already know, and should anything contradict them in order to tell a different story in order to introduce these new elements, will be at best received with apprehension, either because they watched the previous films or because they watched the animated series starring Superman. This is not 100% of the audience, but it is a pretty sizable chunk. Now, the same general audience that goes in to watch a Wonder Woman film is going to go in with a sense of pure discovery. Their image of the character has not been shaped as clearly as Superman's, and this gives the director a bit of slack. So the talented and hardworking Patty Jenkins is logically going to have more freedom when bringing her vision of Wonder Woman to the big screen. Nobody is complaining about certain elements, like the change in saying to World War I, like Diana's duty to kill a god, like the lack of an invisible airplane. In contrast, when a director tries to tackle Superman and bringing new elements such as Superman's fighting style or goals, they're going to be met with heavy resistance, especially when these changes inevitably lead to deviations from the personality fans already associate with the character. The more elements are different from a past adaptation, the more resistance there will be against the current portrayal. Although comparing Zack Snyder's Superman to Richard Donner's Superman is an easy contrast to make due to the discrepancies in the time periods that gave way to the two of them, here is another more relevant example. It's easy to say a film is good when it is loyal to the preconceived notions of the character. It's easy to say a portrayal is better than another when a character is trying to reclaim an image that was already there. But what happens when a director creates a movie with an ambition greater than retelling a story? Check this out. See, if you ask a moviegoer which scene they remember the most from Superman Returns, they might think for a moment and then talk about the scene where Superman gets shot in the eye. But if you go to a filmgoer and ask, hey, which scene did you like from The Amazing Spider-Man 2? They will immediately think of this scene. I don't even have to show the rest of this scene, you know what happens after. You're never going to forget it. This film is rated much lower than Superman Returns, but at least this film dared to go somewhere the previous films with Tobey Maguire didn't. Even when you take the coolness factor, this scene is just radiating something we all already know about Superman. Yes, he's bulletproof, so? But the first time you see this, your heart is racing, and if you're not a comic book fan, if you haven't read the comic, you never forget this scene. Since there is no Wonder Woman movie from the 70s, the 80s or the 90s, I am not surprised Wonder Woman is doing well with the reviews. Much like Man of Steel, it is a movie concerned with only telling its own story. The difference is that here there is no Superman the movie or Superman Returns to compare it to. This goes to show that anytime a director decides to make a film about a well-known character, they had better bring something new, fresh and original to the table. Something that shows us a side of the character that we did not know. The directors for the two Spider-Man series, Sam Raimi and Mark Webb, both chose to tackle the issues of solitude, the lonely path of the hero. Sam Raimi chose to portray this through Peter's love life with Mary Jane and his relationship with his ex-bro, Harry Osborn, while Mark Webb decided to focus on the very physical danger of death that surrounds Peter Parker. And soon we will have Spider-Man Homecoming, where director John Watts is focusing on the adventures of Iron Man and Spider-Boy? The point that I'm trying to get to is that audiences do get tired of getting the same story every time, especially when said origin story is already 75 years old. Here is yet another example. Batman had successfully rebooted his iconic film series before Man of Steel even happened. Batman wasn't a high contrast with his previous incarnation, and what's more, nobody thought Batman was inherently boring when his film launched. Man of Steel had to do a lot of heavy lifting to get the franchise out of the hole it had dug itself into. A lot of people considered Superman a boring hero before Man of Steel happened, while Batman had the advantage of always being considered a pretty cool hero. So when making his reboot, you only have to worry about adding to that mythos. Now, Nolan did a lot of things for the Batman mythos, but one of the most important scenes he added to flesh out the character was the scene where Bruce almost uses a gun. We all know that Batman doesn't use guns, and this scene explains why he doesn't use guns.
I can't.
Your father would be ashamed of you.
And in Man of Steel, everybody knows Clark ends up having to kill General Zod, and then he's clearly disturbed by the fact. This is why he has a no-kill rule in subsequent films. This is why Lex is still alive in Batman v Superman. This shows audiences why Clark is so apprehensive to killing his opponents, which is why it's part of his origin story. But anytime a critic doesn't acknowledge this as a storytelling device, it brings the number down. So the audience sees the number and then subsequently questions rather than understands the film's narrative. This is also called bias. So now we have a scene that is essential to the hero's character development, which nobody understood. I will grant you it could have been done better. I will also grant you that if this film had come out with a 93% tomato meter rating, we would have made an effort to understand it. Oh, and Wonder Woman. Wonder Woman is a fantastic movie because it changed some things from the mythos in order to fit their story. Let me talk some more spoilers here. You know how Diana thinks she is made from clay? Yeah, that's her canon origin story until 2011. This actually happened in the comic, but in 2011 it was revealed that she's actually the daughter of Zeus. Yes, both origins were canon. Do you have any idea how much the tomato meter would have gone down if there had been a previous Wonder Woman movie where she was made from clay and the critics thought they changed the origin in story just because? This isn't just a little fact, this is essential to the story of the movie right here. And it is a very well crafted film. But if this detail was any different from Joss Whedon's planned Wonder Woman movie a few years back, oh boy, watch that number drop. I am so glad this is the first live-action Wonder Woman film we ever have. There is no need for me to make a video defending it. The same goes for Aquaman, the same goes for Flash, the same goes for any of these guys who thankfully have never had a movie before. These characters are going to have a character arc much like Clark Kent is doing here, because that's kind of what happens in good movies. Not that being a flat character is outright a bad thing, but clearly these movies want to make Clark a central character, so you have to sympathize with him on a more human level. Now in some cases I would even consider this mindset a minor form of censorship, as this is essentially suppressing our exposure to the very real moral ambiguity of the darker, more gritty DC universe. Which reminds me of something even scarier. You see, in 1954, a psychiatrist by the name of Frederick Wertham published a book known as Seduction of the Innocent. A study which declares superhero comic books as a medium that encouraged violence, thievery, a rebellious nature, and homosexuality on troubled children. It directly resulted in the creation of a censorship bureau called the Comics Code Authority, which proceeded to ban any comic book that presented moral ambiguity, any use of narcotics, any and all implications of sex, excessive violence, including the use of guns, and many other restrictions. This meant that any comic that didn't carry their seal of approval would see their sales virtually eradicated. As you can imagine, all these restrictions were kind of bad for the artistic integrity of the comic book as a medium. This in turn caused a lot of artists and writers to leave the comic book medium as a whole. In fact, entire companies closed down because of the code. The most famous of these cases is EC Comics, which closed down only 1 year after the Comics Code came into being. And it didn't stop there, or in the 80s, or in the 90s, or in the 2000s. It did slowly lose strength, but it didn't outright stop until 2011. From its creation in 1954, that's 60 years of limitations and restriction on comic books that dared appeal to anything other than children. And that's not even the worst part. Because in 2013, the book that started the whole thing, Wertham's Seduction of the Innocent, came under research by Carol Tilly, professor at the University of Illinois. She discovered the cases Wertham had used were a small sample size of carefully selected cases from a handful of children who had been negatively influenced, presumably by comic books, and these cases were too exaggerated, and when they were not exaggerated, they were fabricated. And still, based on a bunch of BS, the industry turned against superhero comic and in the process chased away writers, artists, and several companies. They could have destroyed the entire industry. It all sounds very archaic, but I need to ask you a question. Would you consider our entertainment nowadays free of any kind of censorship? Wonder Woman establishes that Diana is convinced the General is Ares, and when Diana kills him, she realizes he's the wrong person, with all of that implies. It is correctly called character development. When Clark is forced to kill the right person, saving the planet, it is called a rotten movie. If Zack Snyder wants to make a Superman movie, or a Batman movie, or a Justice League film, it doesn't really matter what kind of a story he tries to tell. It doesn't matter which message he's trying to convey or which version of the character he is portraying to do so. He will be expected to work them within certain limitations, very often limitations which won't make sense with the story. The more history the character has, the less freedom he will be allotted. And if these preconceived expectations of the character are enough to lower the number of some movies and raise it on others, do you really believe we no longer have a censorship level, or have superhero comic books simply changed one level for another? I'm not saying Rotten Tomatoes is outright lying, per se, at least not on purpose and not all the time. But I am saying that if we want artistically mature films, or if we don't want the superhero genre to become formulaic, if we don't want the superhero bubble to burst, we really need to let these people do their fucking job. I'm not even saying you have to like it. I'm saying I will not be ashamed to like this movie and to respect it as a good movie because the number doesn't like it. Should we allow a number from an aggregator website to decide if our choices of entertainment are valid? Then we have learned nothing from the Comics Code mistake. And with film studios investing up to $200 million in comic book movies and getting blasted for the moral ambiguity the codes prohibited, we are going to lose more writers, more artists, and maybe more companies. It is extremely important for us as movie fans, as story fans, to let everyone know right now, while the tomato meter is about 90%, that this freaking number has never been important and it never will be. The DC Extended Universe films have always had far more strength than shortcomings, and we prefer them to reach their ambition than to sacrifice it in order to be more approachable, to be predictable, and to be formulaic. We don't need the approval of this number. The DC Extended Universe may not be as easily accessible as other films, and it would be a shame to make it more accessible through censorship. Because it's a complex place where heroes change the world and the world changes them. Because it's thought-provoking, and when it's not winning Oscars, it prefers to present a serious question than to crack a joke. It's dramatic, it's tense, it's tragic. It's also spectacular, ingenious, and inspiring. And it is epic. And because it needs a clear character arc for heroes that the general audiences expect to be flat, it's constantly going to risk, a low number. Or maybe the Spy Kids series is the best thing to happen to cinema right alongside Sharknado. What do I know, I'm just a sheer curiosity. Thanks for watching the score table, see you around.